Hello and welcome to another episode of The Learning Curve. I'm your host, Julia McLeod. Please join me in prayer. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Heavenly Father, enable me to teach with wisdom, for I help to shape the mind. Equip me to teach with truth, for I help to shape the conscience. Encourage me to teach with vision, for I help to shape the future. Empower me to teach with love, for I help to shape the world. Amen. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. We acknowledge that we are on the traditional land of Treaty 6 and Métis Nation of Alberta Region 4, in which many Indigenous peoples have come before us to call home. We acknowledge the contributions that the Indigenous peoples have provided to help shape our past, present, and future. We commit to restoring and honoring the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action and believe that together our collective communities can build a stronger understanding of all people who dwell on this land and who call it home. We are recording today from our beautiful new studios here at Lumen Christi, our common home in Edmonton Catholic Schools. Today's episode title is Teaching with Intention, Setting Learning Goals. The agenda for today's episode begins with our TSA segment, Tricky Situations in Assessment, with our Director of Curriculum and Assessment, Nicole Lafrenière. In this segment, Nicole will help us navigate and land on solutions to difficult situations in assessment. Today's guest is Angelica Tan. She is a junior high teacher at Holy Cross School. She is also the ESL designate. She'll speak to us today about using success criteria in her classroom. We'll then have our segment, We're Still Doing That, with Deputy Superintendent Tim Cusack, where we'll explore outdated assessment practices and have solutions to help us move forward. That's the plan for today. Let's jump in. Formative assessments can help teachers identify student misconceptions, but it can be challenging to address these misconceptions in a way that supports student learning. What do you advise?
This is one of the places where we need to think about how we structure our class and how the very structure of the class, and so by that I mean the environment, the way we set up the activities in our class, can actually drive instruction. So if I have everyone sitting in rows and it tends to be a little bit more teacher driven, then it becomes a little bit more difficult to give formative assessment that corrects misconceptions with just a few students. If I have a situation where students are a little bit more fluid between pods, where we set things up so that we have some space for students to move and to work in different places, where students can self-identify need, and the teacher is able to then address some misconceptions, then I find that that has been helpful. I can remember a time when I was teaching math actually, and we set up a space in the classroom where we had a conference style space so that I could work with small groups of students. And it became a space where students wanted to come, where they were where they hit a tricky point, where they needed a little bit more assistance. That's where they knew that they could come. But at the same time, kids were always very fluid. It wasn't a situation where only certain students were coming to see me at that table. Another example could be in language arts, where we're doing writing conferences, for example. And so that's where we're setting up some peer-to-peer work. We're also setting up some space for independent work, understanding that not everyone needs to talk through their learning, but then having some space where the teacher can have some feedback with students. So it's really in some of that structural piece that I think that we can address student misconceptions most effectively without maybe pointing out or harming the learning process.
Welcome to the Learning Curve, Angelica. It's nice to have you on today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Can you tell us a bit about yourself and your teaching background?
Yeah, for sure. So I've been a teacher for 5 years now. I teach in a French immersion junior high school for grades 7s, 8s, and 9s. And I've been at the same school since the beginning of my career. So I've been one of the fortunate ones. So I was born in the Philippines, so English or French was not my first language. My family moved to Montreal, Quebec when I was 7 years old, and then again, we moved to Edmonton when I was about 14. So I've been a language learner basically my entire life, from being a French language learner to an English language learner. Um, I've really had to work hard in acquiring the languages that I speak now. And I guess that experience as a language learner has really sparked my interest in language acquisition. So I decided to take education and do French as a second language as my major, um, and eventually doing my master's in teaching English as an additional language. So even though I work in a French immersion school, a lot of the methodologies that I use in my classroom um, comes from my training as a second language teacher, because again, our demographic of students in French immersion schools are really language learners. So I think I found a lot of success with my students in using those approaches, and I've been really enjoying it.
Thanks for sharing your personal experience and that lens you bring to the field of education. In this episode, we're going to talk about success criteria and how success criteria supports the learning for all of our students. So can you share with us how you use success criteria in your classroom?
Yeah. So I think success criteria is really the starting point of a lot of my units and my lessons. And depending on where we are in a unit, success criteria can take different forms. So at the beginning of a unit, success criteria can look like our overarching goal. So, what is our desired outcome, and where do we want to end up um, by the end of the unit? So, once we have that settled, and once we have together as a class discussed what that outcome means and how we can attain that, then throughout the unit, we start developing, checklists. So these can be small checklists just to keep track of the progress of how well they're understanding a specific concept related to that overarching goal. And then at the end of the unit, it can take form as a rubric. So the rubric will be that piece that will inform the students, myself as a teacher, and their parents as to how they've achieved that outcome that we started with at the beginning of a unit.
The TQS talks to us about learning for all students, and they put all in capital letters. So what are the benefits of using success criteria for all students?
So with success criteria, I think one benefit is students get to understand that it's not always black and white. So even if we follow a rubric and the rubric says a certain descriptor, when we work together to discuss those vocabulary or those descriptors included in the rubric, we also work through exemplars. And then for language, in particular for French language arts, we use a lot of exemplars in my class. So that's a strong essay. What does it look like? And what students realize when we work through those exemplars is that a strong essay is not necessarily a perfect one. They will have mistakes, and there will be certain aspects that are not 100% at all times. And seeing those exemplars, students get to understand that it's not necessarily just black and white, and that excellence can take forms in different ways. So working through it together and discussing what makes a strong essay, what makes a proficient essay, and etc., just allows them to better understand where or what they're trying to achieve.
It sounds like you're making mastery explicit to students. What's my path for getting to that point of mastery in my learning?
And I think that's very important because throughout the lessons, students can get distracted, because learning, especially a language, can be difficult. And sometimes, when they feel like giving up, they forget what that goal is. So having the success criteria and having the learning intentions right from the beginning gives us a point of reference that we can use again throughout our lessons to go back to. That way we can refocus ourselves and go back to, okay, so where or what can we do to realign ourselves back, into achieving our goal.
Yeah, the success criteria is an anchoring point.
Yeah.
When we veer off kind of into the weeds, we could always come back.
Yeah.
So can you walk us through your planning process for how you come up with success criteria and those learning intentions and those learning goals that you were talking about?
Yeah. So I always start with the outcome in mind. So working backwards by making sure that I understand and I know exactly what outcome we will be working on, taking that outcome and then discussing it with students. So putting into words or vocabulary that they understand so that they also know where they're headed. And then once we have that outcome set, then the planning for instruction, the search for resources, and the planning for assessment and learning tasks really fall into place. So making sure that you have a specific outcome that you are targeting or specific outcomes that you're targeting, and knowing the appropriate elements that students are required to complete in order to achieve that outcome is really the framework that I like to use when planning for incorporating success criteria in my classroom.
You're not letting the resource drive your teaching. You're driving your teaching, and you're starting with those outcomes first, and then finding what works for your students and who these people are in front of you.
Absolutely. And bringing that French immersion piece, we don't have very many resources that we can use and just follow along, because a resource doesn't necessarily encompass all the outcomes that we need to cover in our classroom.
And I think that is true for English as well. There's not one resource that's going to be properly built for our curriculum. So we need to keep that in mind in our practice.
Yeah.
How has this process benefited your students?
I think starting from the outcome has made learning clear for the students. So knowing that they have a specific goal and a destination in mind helps them refocus. Because again, sometimes with the lessons, it can get complex. It can be challenging, but then just being able to refer back to that learning intention or the criteria that we have set at the beginning of a lesson or at the beginning of a unit. So it helps them refocus, and it makes it clear for them as well where they're headed.
Have you noticed any specific benefits for language learning students?
For language learning, what I've found has been very helpful in using this framework is looking at the outcome and the verb, and then finding the language objective that relates to that specific target outcome, so that I can provide students with the necessary language that they need to be able to complete and find success in completing that specific goal. So whether it's, students should be able to compare and contrast between two different subjects. Well, what is the language that they need to be able to compare and contrast? So understanding that outcome has also helped guide me in the language objectives and the language and planning for the language that they might need.
Really focusing on those subject area outcomes and really understanding them deeply allows us to connect all these other components, so that we're not just salt and peppering randomly these language objectives or these learning skills, but really being intentional with how we design our lessons.
What? Are we still doing that? Memorization tests? Okay, I like playing memory games, like, when you have concentration cards and you have to match pairs. I think there is a time and a space and a place for elements of rote memory and memorization. But to simply have students do a test that's pure recall of facts and information, that really isn't demonstrating to me their understanding of the conceptual understanding of what I'm trying to teach them. So when I think of a test, yes, there will be elements of recall, because we think of, the cognitive load on our students and that working memory, and we know, like, remembering 7 to 10 digits in our working memory is, telephone number. Anything beyond that is kind of a stretch. And sometimes that induces anxiety. what I want to really focus on is what can my students do with the concepts that the knowledge learned? How can they apply that or extend that? So simply having a memorization or a memory-based test isn't always the best way to determine what the student knows, understands, and is able to do. I prefer an extension of learning task where tell me about how you might or how you would, or demonstrate to me what you know about this particular aspect or outcome that broadens their opportunity to share multiple modalities of what they know, what they understand, not just can you recall a certain date, time, or place. So I think we need to leverage memory type of focus activities appropriately, but in terms of a summative assessment, I think we should stop doing that. What do you think?
How do you know that students understand the success criteria? How do you keep track of that? Or what do you do in live time in the classroom to make sure that your students understand the success criteria?
Discussions. I think that's really the biggest piece in my class is being open to discuss with the students. So through discussion with the students, I gain a lot of insight on where they're at in their learning, and based on that, I can modify my instruction. Apart from discussion, I think one important thing too is self-assessment. But self-assessment doesn't just come naturally. You have to prep that as a teacher. You have to model what it looks like for students to be able to effectively self-assess. So looking or going back to our learning intentions and our learning goals and putting them into language that they understand has been very helpful. So once they understand what the learning goals are, then throughout the unit or throughout the lesson, they can go back and self-assess as to whether or not they have attained that specific outcome.
Can you provide us an example of how you teach self-assessment to your students? Like, walk us through how you do this in real time.
Yeah, for sure. So it takes a lot of modeling. So with grade 8s and grade 9s, they need a lot of explicit instruction in order to be able to do it themselves. So at the beginning of the year, a lot of the times, what we do is we look at exemplars together. Based on exemplars, we talk about the strengths of a certain assignment and then maybe areas of improvement. And then once we've had that discussion, then we create a list of what do we need or what is required in order to attain that level of excellence in a certain assignment. Once we've co-constructed that checklist together in using vocabulary that they understand, that is something that they can take by themselves and be able to independently assess their work against an exemplar that we looked at in class using that checklist.
How often do you give time for students to do this self-reflection and this self-assessment?
So at key points throughout the unit, I think it's important to give them the opportunity to self-reflect before, a big assignment or summative assignments. That way, they're able to understand which areas they still need help support in, or which areas they might need some more clarity in. And anytime really throughout a unit.
What I'm hearing is that the ownership of learning is increasingly throughout the year falling on the shoulders of the student. We're really scaffolding them and we're guiding them into that ownership over their own learning. How do you use success criteria and or technology to help students track their learning?
Again, with success criteria, making sure that it's as clear as possible. It allows students to look at it and understand how they've progressed throughout the unit. And then with technology, there's so many tools out there that allow you to get immediate feedback. So there's a lot of Google extensions such as Pear Deck and Kahoot, where you can do certain questions in class, and based on the student responses, immediately you're able to get an insight as to how the students are understanding a certain outcome. But apart from that, Google Classroom is a big piece. So Google Classroom is where I post all of my rubrics, all of my assignments, and students know where to go to find those rubrics. That way, before they submit an assignment, they can go over it themselves, they can revise it, and know exactly where they sit based on the success criteria that we have looked at together.
Teach grade 9. That's one of our PAT years. Have you noticed any improvement in your PAT results because of all this work you're doing during the year and modeling for students and supporting them and scaffolding them through their learning via success criteria?
So with PATs being at the end of the year, one thing that I've told students is, learning is not linear. They can always improve on a certain outcome as long as we are still in class together. So just because we've finished writing the PAT doesn't mean that they can't improve on the writing outcomes that we have in class. Because again, especially for language learning, it takes a lot of practice. It takes a lot of repetition for students to develop that language, and it's not just going to be determined by one specific exam. So I like to cycle through my outcomes throughout the year so they see it multiple times, not just once, because again, I hate to put a grade on an outcome only, at the beginning of the year where students might have easily improved throughout.
So what you're talking about really is directly in the TQS, the Teaching Quality Standard. I think it's 3C, where we have to give multiple opportunities to students so that they can really truly achieve in these outcomes and work towards mastery. And if it's a one and done, we're not going to get there.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, for language learning, I think it's very important to encourage students to keep working on the different competencies, because it can be up and down depending on the context of the task.
So how do you involve parents in this assessment process?
Parents' involvement really starts at the beginning of the year with a strong course outline. So the biggest piece here is being clear with your expectations and your assessment practices right in that course outline. So having that communication be transparent right from the get-go will allow parents to better understand how you will be assessing their children. And then just throughout the year, it's very important to keep consistent communication with them, whether it's through Google Classroom or PowerSchool, because they have live access to PowerSchool. So putting as much comments as you can. So what I like to do is I like to include comments about the outcome in the specific assignment. That way, if parents have any questions, they can refer to that. It's also important to make sure that you're indicating, whether if it's a complete assignment or a late assignment. That way, parents know as well that I'm not assessing or I'm not putting a quantitative number on a student's behavior, but more so on the actual quality of their work and their understanding of that outcome.
Just before we leave off today, what advice would you give to teachers who are exploring the use of success criteria in their classrooms?
I'm still pretty new at teaching. I still consider myself pretty new, only having 5 years of experience. But the biggest piece really is to not stop learning. So whether it's from taking pieces from your colleagues, so looking at how they incorporate success criteria in their classroom and then taking some resources from them to help you alleviate the work that you have to do yourself, and then also reaching out to your consultants. We have so many consultants in a district that are willing to help us gain that strong foundation in ensuring that we are using success criteria effectively in our classrooms. So just making sure that you're also investing that time in building, solid learning intentions and learning goals, spending that time to plan your criteria before starting a unit. That way you're having to do less backtracking throughout your lessons or throughout the year. It really helps manage the load of assessment.
We're now at the end of the episode. Before we sign off, I would like to extend a huge thank you to Angelica Tan for sharing what she does in her classroom in regards to success criteria and learning intentions. Thank you to both Nicole Lafrenière and Tim Cusack for their segments. And last but not least, to you, our listeners, thank you for tuning in to our episodes here at The Learning Curve. A reminder, we're releasing episodes bi-weekly, with each episode featuring different voices and perspectives. Please like and subscribe to this channel to stay up to date with each release. In the meantime, follow us on Instagram at ECSD Learning, our YouTube channel at ECSD Learning, and check out our many resources on our SharePoint site, bit.ly/assessment-ECSD. All 3 links are in the episode description. Lastly, we want to hear from you, both on Spotify and on Instagram. Please share with us your classroom experiences with assessment or anything that you'd like us to discuss on this podcast. That's our time. See you next week on The Learning Curve.